I'm Mo Alethi, Executive Director of the Institute of Politics and Public Service here at Georgetown's McCourt School, and we couldn't be more proud to be organizing this Clinton 25 Symposium. Before we begin the next conversation, much has been said about our first Hoya president and his decision to come to Georgetown to enter the School of Foreign Service, the only school he applied to as a high school student, in part because he wanted to expand his horizons and get a more global view than some other schools would allow him to. So as we prepare to have a conversation about his global vision, we thought it'd be fun to reflect for a few minutes on Bill Clinton and his time at Georgetown. So enjoy this little walk down memory lane, and we'll continue the conversation right afterwards.
We're just on the verge of the movement for racial equality.
200,000 people converge on the nation's capital.
There was a lot of political and cultural movement. So we were involved. It was just a very intellectually fascinating time.
And then you've got those deep fissures that began to emerge in the last years with the Vietnam War, with civil rights.
So to be a college student in Washington, D.C. at that time left you with the notion that you got to do something.
Georgetown in the 1960s was primarily New England and Catholic schools.
When he applied to Georgetown, it was the only school he applied to, and he got in.
I met Bill Clinton the first night I was at Georgetown.
But I think everybody was meeting each other, and certainly meeting Bill Clinton because he was a pretty outgoing guy.
I noticed him immediately because of his accent.
This Arkansas accent he'd be speaking, and then all these people would be laughing, and he's having a good time. Now, things haven't changed in 50 years.
He was very bright and very articulate.
He was very well known at Georgetown. Very affable, very friendly, very active, dynamic.
He has this uncanny ability to remember your families, your friends, your names, your dates.
And when I would hear him talk or sit on the stoop and expand about something, I was convinced this was the guy going someplace.
He is clearly a man of many, many gifts, but the one that was absolutely apparent was an incredible gift for interpersonal relations.
He was a person who knew what he wanted to do. He said, "Would you nominate me for freshman class president?" So I said, "Sure."
You just had a sense that he was, as some people call him, a natural.
The ethos of this place, the women and men for others, the public service, this is very much Bill Clinton.
After Martin Luther King was assassinated, Washington blew up. He just took a piece of paper and drew a red cross and put it on the side of his car and drove down into the burning area. He wasn't affiliated. He didn't call the Red Cross. He just went.
Always reaching out with that Southern people skills that he possessed.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
I don't think anybody ever expects a friend to be president of the United States.
And of course, once he was elected, in the back of everybody's head was, oh, will we have the reunion at the White House?
He was so generous as a friend that he invited all of us to the White House for our 25th and 30th reunions while he was president.
I have had the time of my life tonight. It has been wonderful to see all of you.
I think he is as proud of Georgetown as Georgetown is proud of him. He has always felt that Georgetown made him in many ways.
He has a deep affection for it. I served in his White House for 8 years, and it was always clear from time to time we would talk about some influence of this place.
He could have gone any place, he's so bright. But he could have gone to Arkansas and just been, surrounded by people from the South, but he chose to go and go to Georgetown and meet totally different people, experience different things.
He always presented himself as a kid from Arkansas. I mean, that's who he is, that's who he was, and he was, he felt that was as good as he got.
President Bill Clinton has remained the same.
from the days that I met him at university until today.
That story about him taping a red cross to the side of his car gets me every time I hear it. Let me start with the housekeeping. Georgetown University is committed to standards promoting speech and expression that foster the exchange of ideas and opinions. While it is recognized that not everyone may share the same views as the speakers, it is expected that everyone in attendance at this event respect the right of the speakers and the organizing group to share their perspectives and ideas by not causing a disruption to the event's activities. At the conclusion of the event, there will be a question and answer session during which you may ask questions and engage in dialogue. Please be sure to phrase your comments in the form of a question. And in the interest of time, we ask that each person be concise and ask only one question. And we also ask, while it's very heartwarming to see so many people from President Clinton's class and journalists here, that we, during the event itself, limit the questions to questions from students and the Georgetown community. We are incredibly excited to partner with the Walsh School of Foreign Service on this next discussion, in which we really peel back and take a look at how Bill Clinton viewed the world and what America's role is, what kind of leadership role it could take, and how that impacted America's foreign policy and national security during the 8 years that he was president and beyond. To kick off the discussion and to make the proper introductions of those who will be participating, I'd like to invite up Annie Gott, a sophomore in the School of Foreign Service from Portland, Maine, to introduce our panelists. Annie?
Welcome, everyone. My name is Annie Gott, and I'm a sophomore in the School of Foreign Service studying culture and politics. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to today's event and to introduce our incredibly distinguished guests. I became involved with the Institute of Politics and Public Service my first semester at Georgetown and have been a part of the GU Politics family ever since. Working with GU Politics has been an incredible way to get involved with some of the best events Georgetown has to offer. You certainly don't get opportunities like this at a lot of other schools. But now for the guests we're all here for. Madeleine Albright was Secretary of State in the Clinton administration from 1997 to 2001. Secretary Albright was the first woman to hold the position and at the time was the highest-ranking woman in the history of U.S. government. She received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, from President Obama in 2012. Today, she is chair of Albright Stonebridge Group and Albright Capital Management. She is also a professor in the practice of diplomacy in the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown. An author of 5 New York Times bestsellers, she is currently working on her next book, Fascism, A Warning, that will be published next spring. Ernesto Zedillo was the 54th president of Mexico during the Clinton administration from 1994 to 2000. Since leaving public office, President Zedillo has served on various boards and commissions focused on the environment, drug policy, and elections and democracy. Currently, he is the director of the Yale Center for the Study of Globalization at Yale University. President Zedillo has received many honors over the years, including decorations from the governments of 32 countries and the Franklin D. Roosevelt Freedom from Fear Award. He has also published 4 edited volumes in the past 10 years, including his most recent, Africa at a Fork in the Road. Strobe Talbot was Deputy Secretary of State in the Clinton administration from 1994 to 2001. Before joining the State Department, Talbot worked at Time magazine for 21 years, where he served in an array of posts, including as Washington Bureau Chief, White House Correspondent, and State Department Correspondent. While at Time, he was twice awarded the Edward Weintal Prize for Distinguished Diplomatic Reporting. After his tenure as Deputy Secretary of State, he was the founding director of the Yale Center for the Study of Globalization and then served as president of the Brookings Institution from 2002 to 2017. He is also the author of 12 books. And our moderator today is Joel Hellman, Dean of the Walsh School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown. Prior to assuming his current position in 2015, Dean Hellman served at the World Bank in many senior roles, including as Chief Institutional Economist and Director of the Center for Conflict, Security, and Development in Nairobi, Kenya. He has also worked for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London and has previously taught at Harvard University and Columbia University. I'd also like to thank Dean Hellman and the School of Foreign Service for serving as an academic partner on this panel. Lastly, please don't forget to engage with us on social media during the event using the hashtag Clinton25. We're on all social media channels as @GUPolitics. Now, without further ado, please give our panelists a warm welcome.
Well, thank you, Annie, for that great introduction, and it's wonderful to have you all here. We have a short time, we have a lot to cover, so I'm going to get right into the questions, and then we're going to leave plenty of time for students and members of the community to ask questions. Let me start. Mo sort of set the stage for what we're trying to do here. Although it's wonderful that President Clinton graduated from the School of Foreign Service, we know that when he took office as president, he took office largely focused on a domestic agenda. It's the economy, stupid, a real focus on domestic issues. Can you give us a sense, did he come into office, for those of you who worked with him from the start, with a fully formed view about America's role in the world? Or did his worldview evolve over time, and how did you see that evolution? Maybe we can start with Madam Secretary.
Well, I actually think both. He had a formed view, mainly because he had studied foreign policy a lot here, but also because he had kept up with things that were going on. But I think you have to think about the 90s as a very different phase, where the institutions were changing, the world situation was changing, and therefore his views evolved. But I was ambassador at the United Nations at the beginning, and he was very clear about the fact that he wanted action through the United Nations. And he said, it's hard to believe, but he actually said this, that if he were not President of the United States, he would have been very happy to be ambassador to the United Nations. And so he recognized the importance of looking at the world through multilateral spectacles.
Maybe if I ask Strobe Talbot.
Well, first, it's great to be here. And I can remember the first time that I met Bill Clinton. It was at the time that the 32 Rhodes Scholars of that year were going to sail over to the United Kingdom. And he stood out from the very beginning. And I got to know him particularly well when I was there. We shared a house together. His interest in the world was absolutely exhilarating to hear him talk about it. I made a trip, my first trip to the Soviet Union. There was once upon a time a very large country by that name. During a Christmas break. And he, when I got back to Oxford, he just pumped me with questions. He was full of curiosity. And I might just jump ahead to his coming to the presidency. He was very aware that his chances of being a rather unknown political figure and still be able to ascend to the White House, especially after having to defeat one of the best foreign policy presidents we've had in a long time, George H.W. Bush, that would only happen because, well, maybe not only happen, but he thought it gave him a huge advantage that the Cold War was over. And he came into office wanting to do everything he could to make sure that the Cold War was over and that Russia, post-Soviet Russia, would be able to succeed. More to that story later, maybe, perhaps.
President Zedillo, do you have a sense
well,
of how it addresses
I
of
think
time?
I have a general comment. I met President Clinton when he had already been president for 2 years, at the time that I was elected. But from day one that we met, I had the idea that he did have a vision. And he did have a vision in which diplomacy, engagement, respect to others, active decisions to try to solve problems was in the national interest of the United States, which is, I think, the right way to think about this. You do diplomacy, you do international cooperation, not because you want to do international philanthropy. Of course, every president in the world has to be absolutely convinced that his or her country is first. That's almost stupid to say to say it, because it's so obvious. But Bill Clinton will practice that, and will practice that with the instruments that the United States had led to create for the international community. So I agree with Madeleine that he did have a vision, and that vision, working with the multilateral institutions and using diplomacy was extremely important, and working with the neighbors. I hope I can get into details later on.
Well, I'd like to get into some actual examples of him implementing that vision, and maybe we can start with the end of the Cold War, NATO enlargement. One of the interesting things about the end of the Cold War that it did create the possibility of a bipartisan moment in U.S. foreign policy. I wonder if you can give us some sense of how Clinton reacted to that, how he fostered bipartisanship, and how he thought through the strategy of American engagement to ensure an effective Russian integration into the broader international system, how he moved towards a bipartisan approach to that and worked with our allies to effectively enlarge NATO. Maybe we can start with Strom Talbot with that.
Yes. He was quite convinced early on that it was important to expand and deepen international institutions, as Ernesto just said. And there was controversy over whether NATO had done its thing and should kind of go into history with a good record of not getting us into World War III. President Clinton didn't see it that way. Remember that there was a horrific war in the Balkans, which was a warning that just because Russia and the other post-Soviet states were no longer the evil empire, and the Warsaw Pact was no longer the evil empire, there was still a role for NATO. And one of the things that he did from the very beginning, and Madeleine can tell you more about this, was that he was absolutely committed to the proposition that now that Russia was no longer the evil empire, it should be part of a new world order, and it would have to have hard power and soft power, and NATO was the obvious and most capable source of hard power. And there was one other point he came to talk to a number of us about, and that was if we did not enlarge NATO, countries like the one that Madam Secretary knows so well, a country that also doesn't exist in its current name, and that was Czechoslovakia. If those countries that were caught between the old Soviet Union and NATO Europe and the European Union, and they didn't have a commitment from the United States and from NATO to help them as they go forward, a lot of bad things would happen there, and he kept pointing to Yugoslavia as kind of a lesson that we had to learn.
Well, I think that what was very interesting is that he had, in fact, studied how NATO had been, well, what happened after the end of World War II when half of Europe was, against its will, put behind the Iron Curtain, and then the creation of NATO and all the various aspects. So he did not come into this kind of not knowing any of the background. What I think is interesting is that he also appreciated something that a lot of people haven't thought of, which is that At the end of the Cold War, the U.S. was asked to do something that hasn't been done before, which is how to devolve the power of your major adversary without a land war. And so the question was how to bring Russia into the system. And what I found very interesting at the time was, and Strobe actually was in charge of our relationship with Russia then, and I was up in New York, but basically it was building on what President Bush had done in terms of the reunification of Germany, and then looking at what steps had to be taken to respect Russia and bring it into a system. And so the whole issue of expansion of NATO began in a very step-by-step process with something called the Partnership for Peace, where various countries that had been either part of NATO or later part of what had been the Soviet Union could begin to see how the system worked and play a role in cooperative action. And I now urge people there have been some memos that have been declassified by the Clinton Library, which describe how President Clinton was talking to President Yeltsin at the time about how to do all this in a very staged approach and in a way that Russia would be respected and become part of something and began to have Russia-NATO dialogue. So I admire, first of all, the goal of it, but then also the carefulness with which President Clinton directed that we all take steps to do this in some way that was organized and that, in fact, respected what was going on in Russia. And these memos are so worth reading because it's where President Clinton is talking to President Yeltsin and they recognize each other's politics in addition to recognizing the issue that they were dealing with.
Could I just add just one point, because what Madeline just said brings back a very vivid memory. The Russians hated the idea of NATO bombing Serbia, but President Yeltsin, because of his close tie with President Clinton, was absolutely central in getting the Serbian dictator, genocidal dictator Milosevic out of office, and thereby actually made it possible for us to bring an end to the Balkan wars without having to go into a land war. And that, I think, was a huge accomplishment and a very heroic one on Yeltsin's part, and it was based on his relationship with President Clinton.
We're going to talk in a little bit about him as an individual and how he built relationships, because I'd like to go further into that. But first, maybe if I can ask President Cedillo to talk about his vision towards Latin America and Mexico and the critical bipartisan relationship there and how he moved that forward.
Well, I think I have to start, obviously, with the case of my country, where I think President Clinton gave repeated proofs of his vision that a good relationship with Mexico was very important for the interest of the United States. I think the first test was against what he had hinted or sometimes openly said during his campaign. He became a champion of NAFTA, right? You remember NAFTA was really not rejected by Congress because it was fast-tracked at the beginning of the Clinton administration. And he knew that he will pay a high political cost for being so proactive in his own party, and that also the other major party will, punish him for that. And yet he went ahead, and NAFTA was approved. So that was first test. Second big test was the fact that in late 1994, just as I was becoming president of Mexico, my country faced an incredibly difficult financial crisis, practically unprecedented in modern Mexican history. And this was only a few days into my administration. And I called President Clinton and said, bad news, the country is literally bankrupt. I wouldn't call you except that I have two powerful reasons. One, I need the support not only of the IMF, which we already had a commitment because we had put in place immediately a very strong stabilization and reform program, but this situation is so bad that we need to put together more resources. And the second reason why I called you is because, in my view, if we don't control this situation, it will not be only a Mexican crisis. It will be more systemic. Certainly, it will affect the rest of Latin America. And as we saw in '82 with the debt crisis, the beginning of the debt crisis, this could be systemic to the entire international financial system. He was a little bit surprised. He said, how I didn't know things were so bad. He said, let me talk to Bob and Larry, you know. And then he called me back 2 days later, and he says, in that accent you were commenting, you know, Bob and Larry say that you may be right. I said, yes, of course I'm right. You know, I have a PhD in economics. You only have a law degree. No, I'm just kidding. And,
at Yale.
Right, at the same university. Right? But anyways, he, again, you know, tried to go one way through Congress. He worked with the bipartisan leadership. Once I was in a conference called with the 4 leaders from the 2 parties. But then the thing could not get through Congress. And at the end, I think he did a great act of statesmanship. He used an old facility that existed since the 1930s in the Treasury to lend Mexico the money. And of course, this was not popular, because if NAFTA wasn't popular, well, least of all to lend money to Mexico. And the argument he used over and over again said, you know, this is in the interest of my country. And he had this very nice way to explain things. You know, I told the leaders that if your neighbor's house is burning, you better help your neighbor, because otherwise your house can also get a fire. You know, very, very graphic, very simple arguments. At the end of the day, could not go through Congress, but we got the resources. And he was always very confident that it will be all right. And it was very all right, because I paid him in advance, 3 years in advance. And we always make jokes about this. He said, how did you do that? He said, you were charging me a too high interest rate to prevent moral hazard, you know. And at the end, I think it was a good story of cooperation, an act of statesmanship that he had.
So all your stories are starting to get at Clinton as a decision maker, Clinton as a negotiator, Clinton as a deliberator. I wonder if you can give us sort of some sense, a moment or a story that gives an insight into how Clinton handled a particularly difficult negotiation, a difficult decision. Secretary Albright, in your memoir, you describe him as that it was absolutely impossible for anyone to out-talk him. Can you give us a sense of how he used his personal style to negotiate around difficult issues and to engage as a decision maker as president?
Well, he is a complete extrovert, and he really does like people. And what he always did was to begin in some way, especially in bilateral negotiations with foreigners, is to do something that he knew was important, was to put himself into their shoes and to understand what it is they needed. And that was very clear in just the way that the conversations went. He also knew an awful lot about the country and the person before he began his discussions. But he also was dogged, and he knew that when he went into a meeting that there were certain things that needed to be accomplished. So in between kind of charm and, you know, like your tie opening and how are your children, he would in fact then press the case very carefully. And he knew his facts, and he always used them. And, you know, he was criticized for always being late. He was late because he was so interested in what he was doing at the time, the meeting. He didn't want it to end. And so I do think there was kind of this sense that he liked the subject. He really learned what it was about. And then what was interesting, for instance, at Camp David, he made it a point of sitting down both with Chairman Arafat and then with Prime Minister Ehud Barak, and made them put themselves into the shoes of the other party. And so that was kind of his way of saying, we need to solve this together. It had to be win-win and not zero-sum. He also loved to have us argue in front of him. When there was disagreement in the principals meeting, and then we'd go into the cabinet room or the Oval Office, he wanted to know where we had differed, why we had differed. And he would sit there with a cold, ice-cold tab can to his head, and then a yellow pad, and take notes in columns, and then kind of left what he was going to say. So he was very organized, and yet at the same time, very open and friendly.
Can you tell us, just as a follow-up perhaps, what was the most difficult personal relationship that he had with other foreign leaders in terms of his engagement?
Well, I think that with Strobe talking about Milosevic and people that were really disgusting that he didn't want to meet with, but I think on the whole, I think he tried to find something to deal with everybody. I think that there were people that were difficult to deal with. Prime Minister Netanyahu, for instance. And one of the things that what happened at the time was that President Clinton tried to deal with him in a way that was understanding of what he wanted, and President and Prime Minister Netanyahu would in fact talk about, he was, spoke in idiomatic English and was able to frame things in terms of politics. So even though it was difficult, I think they were able to work their way through it.
Madeline will remember this very well. It was a summit between President Clinton, who had injured himself and was in a wheelchair, and it was one of the most important of meetings with Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin had already reluctantly accepted the fact that NATO was going to move into Central Europe. What he couldn't stand was the thought that 3 of the former republics of the USSR, the Baltic states, would also be in NATO. And I can remember Madeline and I were shooed out of the room, leaving only the 2 leaders, Yeltsin and Clinton. And Yeltsin, who asked for the one-on-one, said, "Bill, I want to do the following. I want to go find a closet somewhere in this house, and you come into the closet with me and whisper in my ear, 'Don't worry, Boris, we will never bring in the Baltic states.'" And then what Madeline was talking about kicked in. I call it empathy, putting himself in the other person's shoe. And he made the following argument. He said, "Boris, it won't be secret, and by the way, we are going to do it, but you do not want to be caught in trying to stop these now independent states for taking the advantage of an international institution that will help them have a better future." And if you can think of that and think of it in this way, if you try to stop it, your neighbors all around your periphery are going to fear you. And if you open it up and proceed with Russia being part of a new Europe and a new world because of what you've done, you will go down in history. And this is what Madeline and I heard from President Clinton afterwards. With that argument, Yeltsin basically melted and said, "Okay, you win."
Normal, no?
President Zedillo.
Well, I think President Clinton is an optimal combination of charm, intellectual curiosity, and diplomat. When you put those 3 things together, it's very hard to see him in an awkward situation. I was, in addition to our bilateral relationship we worked together in different fora, not least the UN and also the APEC meetings, which we would attend practically. He would attend practically every year. When Newt Gingrich closed government, he couldn't attend. He will send Al Gore. But, and I would see him interacting with Jiang Zemin, with the Russian prime ministers. Yeltsin will not go most of the time for health reasons. But the prime minister, not least Putin at the end, was attending as prime minister. And I could see President Clinton, you know, how he will move things around to, you know, to engage and to get things decided. A very difficult moment, of course, was the Asian financial crisis. And we were having the APEC meeting in Canada, in Vancouver, I guess. And the Prime Minister of Japan, Hashimoto, was extremely concerned about the whole situation. And already Japan had been in recession for a few years, and their willingness to cooperate and to be more accommodative to get all the boats lifted there was not particularly good. And I could see, you know, President Clinton, not by pushing, but, you know, by providing arguments why everybody has to put its own part, you know, got things moving in the right direction.
Well, we're going to go to questions in a minute, but before we do, I just want to just go across the panel and ask you if you could identify perhaps the most exhilarating high point in your engagement and relationship with Clinton, and also the most difficult or lowest point, most difficult aspect of the engagement that you had with Clinton on foreign policy issues, at least during your period. If we can start
well, mine, I have to say, is very personal. And it did take place while I was at the UN, and it was to do with the Partnership for Peace. But President Clinton was to meet me in Prague for the meeting with the Czechoslovaks at that time. And what happened was that it was the meeting was shortly after his mother had died. And the Czechs had prepared for giving him a saxophone and for taking him to a jazz club. But the White House advance had decided that that was inappropriate. And I had gone to Prague first, and so I said to President Havel that I had to go to Brussels to pick President Clinton up, that I would ask him what he wanted to do. And then we had a signal that when we got off the plane, Havel would give me a kiss and I would whisper what the decision was. So I asked President Clinton, and he said, of course I want to do it. And so that's what I did. But then the most moving for me was that particular time, coming back to the place of my birth and standing with President Clinton and President Havel in the courtyard of Hradčany Castle as they played the Czech national anthem, which is Where Is My Home, and the American national anthem saying The Land of the Free and the Home of the Brave. And then we went in to have a meeting in the castle, and President Havel said, you know, we're glad to have you here. And President Clinton said, it's truly not fair. Czechoslovakia has 2 representatives at the UN. But the moving time to have him, and then we actually that evening walked across Charles Bridge together. President Havel, President Clinton, and I went to this jazz club. They gave him the saxophone. He played My Funny Valentine. Then he came back and sat down and said, Madeline, you have no idea how hard it is to play a brand new saxophone.
And the most difficult?
And the most difficult with him, I'll tell you what was the most difficult, was, again, Camp David. And what happened was nobody was allowed to leave Camp David except for him to go to Okinawa for the G8 meeting. And just as he was about to leave, Prime Minister Ehud Barak had a very important suggestion about how to resolve it, and President Clinton took it to Chairman Arafat. And then what happened was President Clinton came back and he said, Madeline, I think we've got an agreement. I have to leave, get rid of the underbrush, and when I come back, it'll be done. It wasn't done. I think he was not so happy with me. But one I do have to tell. Another one is we were in Moscow, and I was known for my pins that I wore. And we walk in, and President Putin turns to President Clinton and says, "Why? We always notice what pins Secretary Albright wears. Why are you wearing those 3 monkeys?" And so I actually said, "Because I think your policy in Chechnya is evil." And Putin was furious at me for good reason. And President Clinton looked at me like, "Are you an idiot? You are our chief diplomat. You just screwed up the summit."
That's good. President Zedillo.
Well, obviously, if we speak about, important things for my country, this relationship we developed at this very difficult moment for Mexico. The financial crisis was, extremely important. But there were other moments in which I think we share not only ideas but also commitments. And I always grateful to him for what he did in many aspects, not only in relation to my country. We did have a moment where it was not easy, when the U.S. Was hosting the WTO ministerial meeting in Seattle. He called me actually from the plane because he had been told that Mexico was not supporting the launching of the Millennium Summit. And that was true, on the basis that the United States wanted the round to be launched. We said, this is not right. So he called me, but of course I knew already that other countries, other important emerging countries will oppose it. It would have been very easy for me to say, okay, will not be a problem, right? But I said, he is my friend. I respect him totally, and he listened to arguments. So we had this rather long conversation where basically I went to review my David Ricardo's comparative advantage, right? And tried to explain why the way in which, they were trying to push for a labor chapter into the WTO was not a good idea, and all my, arguments. And I said, and for all of these, I cannot say that Mexico will support the launching of the round. He said, well, I understand. But I was, of course, very, very worried. In no moment during that conversation, he invoked that he was a very good friend of Mexico and that he had been for Mexico at our toughest time. He never used that argument. He just listened and tried to argue, but again, I was the PhD in economics, right? And at the end, we closed the conversation. How Seattle happened, but was not really about demonstrations. That is fiction, that's a legend. Seattle didn't happen because the time was not ripe and the conditions were not prepared. And I guess for political reasons, domestic, the U.S. was pushing for topics that frankly had no way to be adopted. But in any case, I was very worried personally. So, I was due to come to Washington in a few weeks, an official visit again. And my Congress, I had lost the majority in Congress, just as he did in his first midterm election. I lost mine. And now Congress, could do many things. One of the things they did during those days, the Mexican president needed explicit permission from Congress to travel outside the country. And this was politically a very complex moment in my country. And one of the nasty things that Congress did, but they never knew that they did a favor to me, was to say, no, you're not traveling abroad. I said, oh, that's good. I don't have to see President Clinton's face. Thank you. Well, actually, I did see him, at the APEC meeting, and then we met again in Davos in January, and he was so gracious. Again, in Davos, I think he said, Ernesto, maybe you were right. maybe you were right. I said, okay, about saying no. Okay, thank you, you know. And that, again, shows the kind of person he is, you know. Other president of the United States, oh, come on, I lend you money, and now you are. No, he never invoked that. He listened very carefully to the PhD in economics, and that was it.
That's true.
I think one of the most fraught and dangerous incidents brought both a real crisis that he took very seriously and also a real triumph of diplomacy. One of the perennial hotspots, danger points on the planet is the disputed frontier between India and Pakistan. And boy, does Madeline know about this one. She grew up with it. Her father was working on that very dangerous issue early on for the United Nations. In 1999, Pakistan sent some of its soldiers over the so-called line of control into Indian territory. And it was a very, very hairy situation which could have gone to not just war between the two countries, but a nuclear war because both countries had nuclear weapons. The Prime Minister of Pakistan, who is now the Prime Minister of Pakistan again, was caught between his own military and the looming prospect of war with India. And he asked for an invitation to come to Washington and have Bill Clinton fix this matter. And before we could even decide to invite him, he was in the air. And it really ruined the 4th of July weekend that year because President Clinton spent basically the whole weekend in Blair House talking to Nawaz Sharif with this combination of hard-headedness and empathy. And at the end of it, he actually convinced Nawaz Sharif that he had to order that the Pakistani troops move back into Pakistan, and that saved something really terrible. It wasn't the best career move for Nawaz Sharif because he was then thrown overboard or thrown into jail. And by the way, the military was going to hang him, and Bill Clinton got on the phone and convinced them to let him go to Saudi Arabia. So we had at the beginning of the weekend, we had the prospect of the first real nuclear war with both sides having nuclear weapons, and by Sunday night we were okay. And I was just in India last week. It's the second largest country in the world, and he is revered there.
Well, that's great. We now have time for questions. We're taking questions from students and faculty. I believe we have mics on either side. Is that right? Mics on both left and the right. I'd ask you a couple of things. First, please identify yourself. Your name and where you are here at the school. And if you can have a brief question, please, to the panel. Wait for the mic. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Joseph.
Yep, it's working.
Hi, I'm Joseph Mujita, and I'm from Queens, New York, here at the college at Georgetown. My question is, what did President Clinton do to curb North Korea effectively from getting a nuclear weapon, as it is a pressing issue here today, and they've known that North Korea was an issue since 1994 when they signed a non-proliferation treaty that didn't actually work for North Korea. So should they have done more, and should they be held accountable for doing more?
Thanks.
Madeline's the only one on this panel who's been to Pyongyang.
Let me say, I am still the highest level sitting official to have gone to Pyongyang to meet with the leader on instructions from President Clinton. And The story with North Korea is a long, complicated one, and I won't go through all that. But what did happen was that President Clinton sent me there, and we had discussions at that time, and I met with Kim Jong-il in order to talk about issues to do with their missile limits, and also to make sure that they would get rid of their nuclear capabilities. And they were very interesting meetings. We knew very little about Kim Jong-il, but I had excellent discussions with him on very technical matters. And we were in the middle of negotiations, and this was like in October 2000. And we began the negotiations. They were going to go on at Kuala Lumpur. And I had with me some name that is now well known, Wendy Sherman, but she was my counselor. We were together in South Africa, and she was prepared to go to those discussions. Then the election of 2000 happened, and Americans were confused about the election of 2000. Certainly the North Koreans were. So what happened was that I briefed Colin Powell, the incoming Secretary of State, on where the negotiations were. Colin Powell was prepared to continue with what we were doing. And then there was a headline in the Washington Post that said, Powell to continue Clinton policies with North Korea. He was hauled into the White House and told no way. So I hold no brief for the North Koreans. But at the time, that we are the ones that did not continue the negotiations. But at the time, the North Koreans could have done maybe 2 nuclear weapons. They did not. They had no fissile material. They had no ICBMs. And so I think that it was a mistake in terms of not continuing with those particular talks. But they are hard to deal with. There's no question. And this has been something that's been going on since 1953, the end of the Korean War. There is no peace treaty. There is an armistice. I had also signed an agreement called on no hostile intent with Vice Marshal Cho. That was also abrogated. So I think that we bear some responsibility. The North Koreans bear most of the responsibility. And then there is really the issue that I find interesting. Kim Jong-il had said that it was okay with him if we kept our forces in South Korea. So there were a number of different things that were on the table. But we now don't know what his son is like and how things are going to go. The demilitarized zone is one of the most dangerous places I've ever seen.
And I think, Madeline, the axis of evil speech was also a turning point. When you tell a country that the existence of the regime is at play, you should expect a change of behavior. So, and that was after
a
Clinton.
threat of that kind has been issued recently.
Right.
Yeah. I do think one other thing, just in terms of how difficult decision-making is. President Clinton had devoted an incredible amount of time to the Middle East peace talks. And even after Camp David, there were all kinds of talks. And here we were towards the end of his term, and the number 2 guy from North Korea had come in order to invite President Clinton to go to North Korea. And when he'd said, well, I can't just show up, I need somebody to go prepare the trip, which is what I was doing. But at the end, the choice was whether to continue the Middle East talks or go to North Korea. And it was one of those truly difficult issues for any president of the United States, and he chose to do the Middle East.
Okay. Right here in the front.
Good morning. Thank you so much for picking on me. My name is Dinas, and I'm a dual degree candidate with the MBA in the School of Foreign Service. Dean Hellman, always good to see you. My question is with regards to the last 25 years. The fact of 25 years of Russian relations and that Prime Minister Medvedev's comments at the Munich Security Conference within this past year, stating that the West and Russia are sliding into a new Cold War. Does President Clinton look back on these last 25 years of U.S.-Russia relations, and are there any decisions that he would ultimately have done differently? Thank you.
I think about that every day. I suspect Madeline does too. I'm going to give you a simplistic answer because we don't have time for a sophisticated one. No, I do not think that there was something that we could have done or something that we should not have done that would have changed this. I think that personalities, individuals really matter in this world. Boris Yeltsin did many good things. He had huge problems to deal with. His motives were good. He wanted Russia to be a true open democracy and to be accepted into a globalized world. He made one horrendous mistake, and he actually confessed to it to his family just before he died, and that is the man he put in his place at the turn of the century.
They all break. You have a view
Well,
on it?
I agree, and I do think that there is no way to reiterate how much time President Clinton spent in terms of paying respect to Russia, working, understanding the fact that we had this peculiar duty to devolve the power of our adversary, and trying to put himself into President Yeltsin's shoes. And I do think that there are those who believe that NATO expansion was a big mistake. I happen to think the opposite, and so does Strobe and President Clinton. And I think that had we not done that, then first of all, those countries were entitled to, they had been, quote, liberated by the Soviet Union against their will. And we had, in fact, offered Russia ultimately to come into NATO if they were prepared and wanted to. So there have been a lot of myths connected with this that I think are definitely myths. I do think, and what was interesting, both Strobe and I, even I was allowed to stay for that summit despite my early points.
Problem.
But it was interesting to watch because President Putin is very smart. He spoke without notes and took notes, but already you could see he was stiff as a board and unfriendly in so many different ways. And he has clearly evolved into something like that even more so. So I think we did what we could, given what we knew at the time.
Yeah. In the back there. Yeah. Blue shirt. Yeah.
My question is, was there also a national security rationale on President Clinton's decision to let China join the WTO or to push for China joining the WTO?
Well, let me, from what I know about this, is first of all, we were generally trying to figure out an improved relationship with the Chinese. I am the oldest person sitting up here and was part of the Carter administration. And one of the issues there was, in fact, the normalization of relations with China and trying to figure out, again, how to bring them into the system. Most of the time that we dealt with China, we had to look at the most favored nation clause and also judge their human rights activity, and it made the Chinese crazy, and really it was like pulling up a plant to see if it was growing, and it really made for a lot of problems. So one of the things that the Clinton administration did first was to go for permanent trading relations, and that was the beginning. And then the WTO, in order, frankly, to make the Chinese abide by the rules, not only because we were saying so, but because an international organization would be able to also go with the same kinds of points in terms of what it was like to join the international trading system.
I think it's always in the interest of any country, and certainly the United States, to have others abiding by a rules-based system, which is what the WTO is. Having China, already an important economic power in the 90s, not as much as today, outside the system would have been crazy. Now, a little known fact is that the last country that closed the negotiation with China was not the United States. It was Mexico. You know, Mexico, because we were very aware that they will be terrible competitors for Mexico, not only in the US market, but in what we thought we had comparative advantage. So I think, of course, China had to be part of the WTO because it was in the interest, certainly, of China, but also of the others, even Mexico.
Okay, another question. Let's see. Can I maybe go here, just right here? Thanks.
Hi, good morning. My name is Adam. I'm a freshman in the School of Foreign Service. So my question is, not to be too morose, or besides the lack of intervention in the tragic Rwanda genocide, what would you say was Clinton's largest regret? Thank you.
That he didn't go to North Korea.
I would say also his regret that he didn't feel he was responsible for, but he sure regretted that he couldn't get the peace process over the line. And we've heard him on a number of occasions
The Middle East, you mean?
Yes, the Middle East. Yeah. The Middle East. I've heard him say many times that just as the life of a statesman can make huge differences, good or bad, in the world, so can the death of a statesman. And that means Rabin.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, I'm trying to see more diversity in our group. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Arjun, a sophomore in the School of Foreign Service. So my question is that given nuclear proliferation in South Asia and the Taiwan Straits crisis, do you think President Clinton anticipated the extent to which China would rise militarily, the military modernization, and the extent of the US-India defense engagement?
I think I got it, and if I didn't, my colleagues will help, or maybe you can put the question again. One reason that President Clinton was extremely concerned about the Indian test of a nuclear weapon was not that he felt India was going to be an irresponsible player on the global stage. It was because it would be opening up the sluice gate of other countries, and we knew exactly who would be the next. And we would have as many as 20 nuclear-armed countries over the course of the next couple of decades, and that did happen. And he tried everything he could to bring the Indians into the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. He sent, talk about a mission impossible, right after the Indians tested their weapons, he sent me off with a team to Pakistan, and the Pakistanis were gracious enough not to blow up their own bomb just as our plane was getting off into the air after we were trying to persuade them not to do it. And of course, now we have North Korea, and Madeline has given you a very good précis of what we tried to do there.
I do think that one of the things, it goes back a little bit to your first question, is President Clinton, a lot of people kidded him about this, but he always kept talking about building bridges to the 21st century. And I was the last Secretary of State of the 20th century and the first of the 21st. The only problem with that statement is I started making it kind of 6 months after I'd been named, which was kind of, presumptuous to think that he would keep me the 4 years. He did, and so I am. But the bottom line is that it was interesting to listen to him think about the various agreements that had to be made, how you really set the stage for having some kind of an organized international system, how to use the United Nations, the Summit of the Americas, any number of kind of institutional things. He was trying to solve immediate problems, but at the same time he would push us to think about what were the institutional structures that had to be put into place very deliberately. And also that meant where China was going to be and just generally the relationships.
Well, I'm going to ask the last question, which is, we hope that presidents learn from each other and their experience. If you had to crystallize one lesson from the Clinton presidency in foreign affairs to give to the current president, what would it be?
Boy, I was expecting a much tougher question. It goes back to something Ernesto said, I think, in pretty much in the first round. Bill Clinton came into office convinced that because the Cold War was over, because that great schism was passing into history, we thought, he wanted to use his presidency to make the United States a leader in a collaborative world and make the United States a leader in international institutions, the ones, of course, that Madeline and Ernesto know so well. And I remember once when he was trying to formulate a doctrine for his administration. And I think Madeline was in the room at the time. And when he talked privately with us, it was clear that that was the Clinton doctrine, to have a collaborative world. And he, if you read the several books that he has written since, I think he's particularly proud of that, and I know what his advice to the present President of the United States would be.
Oh, don't ask that question to a bad hombre. Don't get me going. Don't get me going. You know, being here at Georgetown and an event on President Clinton, I feel like what some of my students were demanding at some demonstrations a couple of years ago on campus. Say, we want a safe space. I now feel a safe space. And then you come with your question. I think I would say that what Strop said is absolutely right. If anybody could explain to the present President of the United States that the world is not, in economics, in security, a zero-sum game, you know, that somebody has to lose so that the other wins, that will be great. I think he missed that in the school he went, which, by the way, I will be visiting UPenn tomorrow, give a lecture. Not on that, of course. But I think that's so important. And this question of the national interest, you know, cooperation is in the national interest. Respect to others is in the national interest of the United States. If you really believe, as he should be, that his country, the US, is first, then practicing diplomacy and respect other countries should be first too, because it's in the interest of the United States.
Or to put it this way, America should be first in leadership of the world.
I don't know about that. You know, doing that, I think China, no, you know, that's a point of difference. You do that by doing things, not by telling people.
Yeah.
And that's another very distinct thing about Bill Clinton. He will sometimes speak for the domestic audiences, but he was very careful not to say something that will backfire to him from others by hurting or robbing the power. Remember, this is the unilateral. President Clinton was the president of the unilateral moment of the world, which is over, by the way. Se acabó, right? And he could have been terribly petulant and arrogant, and he wasn't. And I think that's the big lesson that should be thought about.
Well, it's interesting. We have a similar theme, and I think that what happened when President Clinton came into office, and you started this also by saying, you know, that he came in and started talking about, is the economy stupid? Part of the issue was that he had followed a set of presidents that had spent a lot of time on foreign policy and not on domestic policy. And so what he did that I think was brilliant was to kind of really link domestic and foreign policy. And one of the things was that he was the first one to use the term indispensable nation. I said it so often that it became identified with me, but he really did say it. And he said it in order for the American people to understand that we had to be engaged abroad, that if we weren't, nothing would happen. And so it was a message that really was supposed to show that our leadership was needed if the American, and you pointed out the duties of a president, you know, it really is to have your national interest first and to protect your territory, your people, and your way of life. But he understood that that took place within an international setting, and that one needed to engage and get the respect of the other countries and operate with them with a way that you treated them as equals. What I am worried about is that we are about to become the dispensable nation, where nobody thinks that we do have a role to play, and I would hope that the president, the current one, would in fact understand that what he is trying to accomplish requires the United States to be engaged in a respectful way and stop tweeting.
To begin with.
Well, look, let me thank our extraordinary panelists for a great and engaging conversation. Let me thank the Institute of Politics and Public Service for co-sponsoring this with us and for putting on this extraordinary weekend events, Mo'oleti, celebrating Clinton 25. And let me thank all of you for joining us for this great conversation. I want to remind you to stick around for the next panel, which is on vision of leadership and service, and also to tune in to the keynote with President Clinton, either in person or via live stream at 4:15. But now, I want to thank you and thank the panelists for a great discussion. Thank you.